Iryna Zarutska's story begins far from Charlotte. She was just 23 years old, a Ukrainian refugee who fled the horrors of war in search of peace, opportunity, and the promise of America. Friends described her as bright, ambitious, and endlessly kind, a young woman studying, working, and building her life like so many immigrants before her. To Iryna, the light rail system in Charlotte was simply a way to get to work, to school, or to meet with friends. It was supposed to be safe, ordinary, uneventful. But on August 22nd, 2025, that ordinary ride turned into her last. Without warning, she was targeted in what police would later describe as a completely random attack. The scene was sudden, chaotic, and tragic. The life of a young woman, who had already endured so much by leaving her war-torn homeland, was cut short in the very place she thought she'd be safe. The news sent shockwaves through Charlotte and beyond. This wasn't just another crime statistic. This was the story of a daughter, a friend, and a dreamer who had come to America believing in its promise, only to be betrayed by a system that failed to protect her. Who could do something like this? And why was a dangerous man free to roam the streets of Charlotte in the first place? Those questions gripped the city as investigators began to piece together the horrifying truth. As the hours unfolded after Iryna's death, attention turned quickly toward the man accused of taking her life, someone who, by all accounts, should never have been walking free. His name would soon become a symbol of everything broken in America's justice system. But before his story is told, the world would first learn how Iryna's final moments shocked a nation. The attack itself was as senseless as it was swift. Passengers on the Charlotte light rail that afternoon remember nothing unusual at first. A quiet ride, a handful of commuters staring at their phones, others staring out the window. Iryna sat alone, likely thinking about the ordinary things of life, her next shift, her classes, her future in a new country. And then it happened. Without provocation, without a word exchanged, a man lunged at her. Witnesses later described it as surreal, violence exploding out of nowhere in what had seemed like the safest of places. In seconds, panic swept through the car. Passengers scrambled to press emergency buttons. Some shouted for help, but it was too late. Iryna's life had been taken in an act so brazen, so shocking, that even hardened police officers admitted it left them shaken. The light rail ground to a halt, and officers swarmed the scene. The suspect was subdued and taken into custody almost immediately, but the damage had been done. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her lay lifeless, while the city tried to comprehend what had just happened. News traveled fast. Social media filled with stunned reactions, grief, and anger. How could a refugee who escaped Russian bombs end up murdered on a commuter train in the heart of America? And why had nothing stood between her and a man so dangerous? For Charlotte, this wasn't just another crime headline. It was a collective heartbreak. But for those watching closely, it was also a warning. The man they had arrested wasn't an unknown drifter, some ghost who slipped through the cracks. He had a long, visible record, which raised the chilling question: if everyone knew he was dangerous, why was he free? That answer would soon ignite outrage nationwide. The man arrested that day was 34-year-old DeCarlos Brown Jr., a name well known to local law enforcement. He wasn't a first-time offender, not even close. Brown had racked up a staggering 14 prior arrests. His record stretched across violent crimes, assaults, and charges that should have kept him behind bars long before August 22nd. Yet, despite that history, he walked free. Not because the police didn't do their job, but because the system bent over backwards to give him chance after chance. Neighbors had long whispered about his volatility. Court documents revealed repeated violent outbursts. Judges and prosecutors knew his name, and yet each time he slipped back onto the streets. The most alarming part? He was out on cashless bail. That meant that no matter how many times he was arrested, no matter how serious the charges, he could walk free without putting down a single dollar. It was a revolving door of leniency, one that prioritized the offender's second chances over the safety of innocent people like Iryna. This wasn't a man quietly trying to rebuild his life. Brown's past showed a consistent pattern of violence, lawlessness, and disregard for human life. But soft-on-crime policies treated him as though he were harmless. And it was those very policies that put him in the same train car as Iryna on that fateful August afternoon. For many Americans, the details of his rap sheet were enough to spark fury. 14 arrests, 14 warnings ignored, 14 opportunities to prevent tragedy wasted. So the natural question became, who allowed this? Who decided that a repeat offender like Brown deserved freedom over accountability? The trail of responsibility led not just to one man's crimes, but to the very policies shaping Charlotte's justice system. And that's where the real controversy exploded. DeCarlos Brown Jr. didn't just slip through the cracks, he was practically ushered back onto the streets by a political experiment in justice gone wrong. Charlotte, like many Democrat-run cities, embraced cashless bail and reform policies that promised fairness but delivered chaos. The idea was simple: don't keep people locked up just because they can't afford bail. In theory, it sounded compassionate. In practice, it meant violent repeat offenders like Brown walked free again and again, no matter how much blood was on their record. This wasn't some abstract debate in a law school classroom. These policies had real consequences, and Iryna Zarutska became one of them. Her killer had been arrested multiple times, yet each time the court released him, citing equity and systemic justice. Judges and prosecutors, following the political winds, treated Brown as though he were a victim of society, not a predator threatening it. Local leaders in Charlotte had long claimed the city was safe, even as crime spiraled out of control. Violent assaults rose. Repeat offenders cycled in and out of jail like clockwork. And yet officials doubled down, insisting the problem wasn't criminals, but root causes like poverty or homelessness. But for Iryna, the root cause was simple: a dangerous man, emboldened by a broken system, had free rein. And here's the bitter truth: this wasn't an isolated failure. Across America, cities under Democrat leadership have pushed the same soft-on-crime playbook, turning once thriving communities into danger zones. Charlotte's tragedy was part of a larger pattern, one that Republicans had been warning about for years. As the public absorbed the horror of what happened, anger turned toward the system itself. Why was Iryna denied safety in the very country she sought for protection? And why were leaders more interested in protecting criminals than protecting her? Those questions burned hot as charges against Brown were announced. After his arrest, prosecutors wasted no time charging DeCarlos Brown Jr. with first-degree murder. The case seemed clear: a repeat offender, a random act of violence, and a young woman dead. But while the legal machinery turned, the city of Charlotte reeled. Candlelight vigils appeared at light rail stations. Flowers and Ukrainian flags covered sidewalks where grieving strangers gathered. Her story wasn't just about loss, it was about betrayal by the very justice system meant to keep her safe. For the local community, heartbreak mixed with fury. People demanded answers. How could someone with Brown's record be free? Why did judges and policymakers ignore the danger signs? Iryna's friends spoke to reporters, describing her as a bright soul who wanted nothing more than to live the American dream. Now that dream was gone. Yet city officials responded cautiously. Some framed it as a tragedy of mental health and societal challenges, sidestepping the glaring reality of policy failure. For many, that response only deepened the anger. Citizens saw their leaders more concerned with making excuses than with accountability. And while Democrats tried to soften the narrative, the crime's brutality became impossible to spin. Local talk radio lit up with callers furious at the revolving door justice system. Comment sections filled with outrage at politicians who had championed bail reform. In Charlotte, fear spread. Ordinary commuters asked if they'd be next. This wasn't just another headline. It became a flashpoint in America's larger fight over crime, justice, and leadership. And within days, the highest office in the land would weigh in. The President of the United States had been watching closely, and when Donald Trump spoke, he transformed the local tragedy into a national reckoning. When President Donald Trump addressed the nation about Iryna Zarutska's murder, it wasn't just another statement of sympathy. It was a thunderclap. He described Iryna as a young woman with a bright future, someone who had escaped war only to be cut down by policies that put criminals first and citizens last. His words carried both grief and fury. This was preventable. She should still be alive today. In an Oval Office address, Trump didn't mince words. He called the attack a direct result of failed Democrat soft-on-crime policies, pointing out that 24 of the 25 most dangerous cities in America are run by Democrat mayors. Charlotte, he said, was not an exception. It was the rule. And he promised Americans that under his leadership, law and order would not just be a slogan, but a reality. Trump highlighted how his administration had already transformed Washington, D.C., once a symbol of crime and dysfunction, into what he declared a crime-free capital. That, he promised, was only the beginning. His vision: extend that transformation nationwide, restore safety to every city, and ensure no more families suffered what Iryna's had. But he went further than sympathy and promises. Trump demanded accountability. He called out the system that released Brown again and again, and vowed to prosecute violent criminals harshly, using the full weight of federal law when states and cities failed. For Trump, this wasn't just about one tragedy. It was about a national epidemic of lawlessness fueled by political cowardice. The president's words electrified his base, reassured fearful communities, and infuriated Democrats who scrambled to defend their record. But love him or hate him, one fact was undeniable. Trump had seized the moment, turning Iryna's story into a rallying cry for justice, and Republicans across the country echoed his call. Trump's words lit a fire, and Republicans across the country quickly followed his lead. JD Vance, the vice president, hammered home the central point: the so-called big lie of systemic crime. For years, Democrats had pushed the idea that crime was society's fault, not the criminals. Vance rejected that outright. He argued that violent offenders like Brown don't need therapy sessions and second chances. They need prison cells and long sentences. His blunt message resonated with Americans tired of excuses. Charlie Kirk took to the airwaves with fury, blasting the mainstream media for their silence. He pointed out that if the victim had fit a more convenient political narrative, news outlets would have plastered her story everywhere. But because Iryna was an innocent young woman murdered by a repeat offender in a Democrat-run city, the tragedy was downplayed. The media protects the narrative, not the people, he declared. Benny Johnson zeroed in on the judge who had released Brown on cashless bail. He accused the judicial system of blood on its hands, saying every decision-maker who let Brown roam free bore responsibility for Iryna's death. His words spread quickly online, igniting anger at the faceless institutions behind the crime. And in North Carolina itself, Representative Mark Harris and Speaker Tim Moore sharpened the attack. Harris called Democrat policies a moral disaster, while Moore declared that leftist leaders had blood on their hands. These weren't just speeches. They were indictments of an entire governing philosophy that prioritizes ideology over safety. For Republicans, Iryna's story became more than one tragedy. It became proof. Proof that soft-on-crime policies don't just fail, they kill. Their voices rose in unison, demanding justice not only for Iryna, but for every victim ignored by a broken system. But as Republicans rallied, Democrats and their allies in the media scrambled to shift the blame. While Republicans thundered about accountability and justice, Democrats struck a different tone, one that many found tone deaf. Charlotte's Democrat mayor, V. Lyles, insisted the city was safe, even as residents grieved a young woman murdered in broad daylight on public transit. Instead of acknowledging the failure of policies, she pointed to broader issues: mental health, homelessness, and the need for more social safety nets. For grieving citizens, it sounded less like leadership and more like deflection. National Democrats echoed the same themes. They framed Brown as a man failed by society, not as a predator who failed society himself. To many, it seemed like they were searching for excuses rather than demanding justice for Iryna. Meanwhile, the media played its part. Outlets like CNN and Politico accused Republicans of politicizing the tragedy. Some commentators even suggested that MAGA supporters were exploiting Iryna's death by focusing too much attention on it. Think about that. A young refugee brutally murdered, and the outrage wasn't at the killer or the policies that enabled him, but at Republicans for daring to speak out. This response only deepened the divide. To Republicans, it confirmed what they had been saying for years. Democrats care more about protecting their policies than protecting victims. To Democrats, it was about defending their vision of a justice system that avoids harsh punishment at all costs. The clash became a national spotlight moment with two visions of America laid bare. On one side, accountability, consequences, and protecting the innocent. On the other, excuses, abstractions, and a refusal to confront hard truths. But while politicians bickered, a seismic shift was about to occur, one that would take the case far beyond Charlotte's courthouse. The federal government was preparing to act, and its decision would change everything. On September 9th, less than 3 weeks after Iryna's murder, the case escalated to a level few expected. The Department of Justice, under Attorney General Pam Bondi, announced sweeping federal charges against DeCarlos Brown Jr. These weren't symbolic charges. They carried the ultimate consequence, eligibility for the death penalty. It was a decisive move, and one that marked a sharp contrast with the leniency of Charlotte's local system. Where local judges had once released Brown again and again, the federal government was now making it clear. This time, there would be no revolving door. Bondi's DOJ laid out a case that treated Iryna's death not just as a local tragedy, but as a national failure demanding national justice. For many Americans, this was the moment they had been waiting for. At last, someone in power was saying, enough. The cycle of excuses, the endless second chances, the prioritizing of criminals over victims, it ends here. Federal prosecutors signaled they would bring the full weight of the law down on Brown, ensuring he faced the harshest penalties possible. President Trump praised the decision immediately, framing it as a turning point in the fight for law and order. His message was blunt. If local officials won't protect their people, we will. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was action, and it sent a warning to every city across America. The federal government will no longer tolerate soft-on-crime policies that cost innocent lives. For Iryna's family, for her friends, and for countless Americans who had watched her story with outrage and sorrow, the DOJ's decision offered something that had been missing from the start: hope that real justice could finally be done. But beyond justice for one young woman, the case raised a larger question. Would this be the moment America finally reversed course on crime? Iryna Zarutska's death was more than a tragedy. It was a wake-up call. A young refugee full of promise, murdered not because of fate, but because a system chose ideology over safety. Her story forces us to ask, how many more lives must be lost before leaders admit the obvious? Under Democrat policies, violent offenders like DeCarlos Brown Jr. are treated as victims, while real victims are forgotten. Charlotte's leaders defended their record, pointing to homelessness, mental health, and abstract root causes. But those abstractions didn't protect Iryna. They don't protect anyone. What protects people are laws enforced with strength, courts that prioritize victims, and leaders unafraid to put criminals where they belong. That is exactly what Republicans are demanding and delivering. Trump's administration has already proven what's possible, taking Washington, D.C. from crime-ridden chaos to what he proudly calls a crime-free capital. With the DOJ under Pam Bondi now pursuing federal charges that could bring the death penalty, it's clear. This administration isn't just talking tough, it's taking action. Republican leaders like JD Vance, Mark Harris, and Tim Moore are showing Americans the path forward. One rooted in accountability, not excuses. One that honors Iryna's memory by ensuring her fate doesn't become someone else's tomorrow. The implications are enormous. If Republicans succeed in restoring law and order nationwide, then the revolving doors of bail reform and the excuses of progressive policies will finally slam shut. Innocent people will once again have the protection they deserve. Iryna's life, stolen too soon, now stands as a symbol of what's at stake when justice fails, and what can be achieved when true leadership steps up. Her story is a tragedy, but it may also become a turning point. Because when America chooses law and order, it chooses to protect the innocent. It chooses to make sure no one like Iryna is ever failed again.